I'm not going to have any Sequinotus stuff, and hopefully Annie's going to be able to cover all that stuff next month, as Elizabeth said. So that should be cool. So you can look forward to that. We did have a really nice time, decent weather, and lots of mushrooms. Elizabeth said 275 or 6. Right at the end, Natalie was able to add in quite a few lichens, and so we were just under 300. I think it was like right around like 298 or something. I haven't had a chance to get back to the list and do a proper count of how many lichens she added. So in general, over the years that I've been going, I think one of our highest was around 220. So we blew past that pretty good. So apparently they may have found more in the past, but hey, that's a pretty good showing if you ask me. Okay. Anyway, let's hop into the ID table. All right, let's jump right in. If I can make this thing work too. There we go. All right, so first off, by April Wyman submitted this one. She found that at the Frederick Watershed. It does display one thing that can be kind of frustrating when it comes to cauliflower mushrooms, is how they can get kind of gritty. They can be quite hard to clean, but that's a lot of wild mushrooms that you find. So there are a couple of species of cauliflower mushrooms that we can find. Apparently this version can be found under both conifer and oak. But one thing that makes it stand out is these zonate lobes here. It's also not quite as noodly looking as the other one. So I tend to call this one Spiraeus spathulata. There we go. Let me get that out here. And the other one is now Spiraeus americana. You may have heard it called Spiraeus crispa. And so I believe that's a European species. So they've changed the one that we find here. And that one's usually found under conifers. Both very tasty mushrooms. But you can see it's probably hard to clean. I bet you could put that in a salad spinner, or rinse it off, put it in a salad spinner, and then clean it off pretty good. All right, this is always a cool one. So Corey found this one in DC. Looking at it from far away, it just kind of looks like this weird black knob on an old fallen log. Oh, look at that. I just noticed it looks like there's probably some Gliophyllum sepiarium poking out right there. That's one growing on conifer. This looks like a conifer. I may be wrong. But when you get up close, so you can see this like little veil tissue around here. This was actually covering the entire fruiting body when it was young, and it ruptures and opens, and then it reveals this lovely dog nose. So this is Chamaerops petersii, they call dog nose fungus, and you can see why. So this is ascomycete, and so all those little bumps are actually perithecia, where it's kind of like a little flask-shaped thing, and as the acci mature, they'll poke through the hole, and the spores erupt out, and that shrivels up, and the process continues, and it kind of keeps going until it's run its course. I always like finding that one. Not edible, but it looks cool. All right, another one submitted by Corey, found in DC. So I'm putting a question mark on this one, because when you go to these weekend forays, you talk to some really knowledgeable folks that have been doing this monthly or sometimes weekly, and they're talking to a lot of other knowledgeable people, and you start realizing, well, maybe what I'm calling Sterium complicatum may not be Sterium complicatum. It might be something else. But for what we're looking at, we can see it is a Sterium, which is a crust instead of being a polypore. And it's hard to gauge the size on internet photos. So it's kind of hard to tell how big these actually are. And sometimes there's little features like rubbing it with your finger and seeing if there's staining reactions. So I think putting Sterium complicatum, because complicatum is kind of indicating how the complex pattern and how closely crowded they are together. So this certainly fits that bill, but it may or may not be that exact species if you were to look at the DNA. Another one found by Corey, found in DC. Hopefully by now, you guys are starting to recognize this if you don't already. Pretty classic. You find them all the time, especially in the summer month, like around now, if it's been rainy. Pretty cool seeing it in an actual fairy ring here. You can see it's got some free gills. I don't know if it's just the shading or not, but these will eventually form start getting green due to the spores maturing. And so this is why they call this one the green spored Lepiota, Chlorophyllum molybdites. And we were talking to one of the guys this weekend. He said he's going to try and look into changing some of these common names, because this is not a Lepiota. This is now a Chlorophyllum. But be careful of these. They're beautiful mushrooms, but they will make you extremely ill. So that's certainly one to learn and to avoid. All right, here's one submitted by April Wyman. She found this at the Frederick Watershed. I haven't found too many of these this year. These are fun to find. And if she would have given that gill section right there a little slice, you would have started seeing this white latex dripping out voluminously, as they would say, considering this is Lactifluus voluminous, or the voluminous latex milky. This is a good edible. And that brings up another note is in the name. And so you guys probably know this as Lactarius voluminous. And, it was pointed out this weekend that this is actually a really good choice by, the scientists working on this, because this genus is actually closer relation to Russulas than it is to Lactarius. And so this looks like this is actually a good genus to have been created. So it's not one of these frivolous things that, why'd they do this? We actually we know why they did this. So, and these are good edibles. There's actually a group of these. One is much darker on the top, and a lot of times wrinkly, and it also have a darker stipe. They tend to have concolorous or the similar color cap to stipe, and have kind of a fishy aroma. But these are, they call them sometimes the milky beefsteak too. Okay, another one found by April. This is one that is extremely common. It's got some classic signs of what it is. And so there are many mushrooms that will have radial lines on the top, but that's pretty classic in this group. And basically what's happening there is you're seeing the gill through the cap. So the cap tissue is quite thin. And so you can see that's what those radial lines are showing. So Russulas will have these often. Now we don't see the base here, which maybe that's a little piece of the vulva sac. So this is actually an amanita. It'll have some sort of universal veil that would have been covering the entire mushroom before it ruptured out. Sometimes it leaves patches, as you've seen, and sometimes it leaves a little membrane at the bottom. Many times they will have an annulus or a partial veil. This is a group that actually doesn't. So this is the vaginata group, and so there's quite a few different of the grisettes is what they call. This is actually Amanita fulva. And if you found many of these, you will have noticed that some can be huge and some can be small. None of them have rings. Some are gray capped. That would be your typical grisette. And this is the tawny, being that the cap is brown or tan like this. I have a feeling that one of these days, somebody's going to really delve deep into some of these grisettes, whether it's the tawny or the regular, and start seeing that this is actually a huge species complex, and there's going to be a bunch of different ones one of these days, but we'll see. Maybe they just have different ways of growing, whether it's environmental or what they're associated with. This is an amanita, and amanitas being mycorrhizal. So anyway, that's your tawny grisette. This is a purported to be an edible group. I have never tried them myself, and being it's an amanita, you need to be careful. I don't know, I may have talked to a couple of people who have tried these, but I don't know anybody that eats these, and that's probably a good idea, being they are amanitas. Oh, this one's cool. You guys might remember this one. We've had it, I think maybe 2 months ago. And so you can't really see the base, but you'll see it has a general stature of that last mushroom we were just looking at. It's got free gills, which is a pretty classic sign in amanitas. This one does have an annulus or a ring. This one has kind of scales on the cap, but these are like really puffy flocos, like real like powdery stuff. And so this is actually the remnants of the universal veil, and it tends to be even powdery all the way up and down. But one thing that's cool about this guy is it is an amanita, but it's not mycorrhizal. This is Saproamanita. Whoops. Oh yeah, there we go. Saproamanita thiersii, Thiers lepidella. Sorry, I was looking at this and it changed the other slide, and I was like, uh-oh. Anyway, I'm not used to that. So anyway, this is actually a saprobic amanita instead of being mycorrhizal. And I don't know if its numbers are on the rise in our area, but we seem to be, I'm getting lots of submissions for this. I think we even found one in the woods, a month or two ago. So that's kind of cool. Anyway, that was in Frederick and Baker Park. And you can see this one's more of a lawn mushroom, not usually in the woods. All right, David Lee sent this. He was out at Mount Rainier, spell that right, National Park. I thought I'd throw this one in. It's a little blurrier than I thought at first. It's not one we find in our area, unfortunately, unless maybe if you go up to the mountains, you might see it. So this is actually a hypomyces. This is Hypomyces lactiflorum. They call it the lobster mushroom. This is a mold attacking a mushroom, but it turns what would be a blah or even gross mushroom into a very tasty mushroom. Apparently it can infect Lactarius piperatus, and if you guys know that one, if you taste that one, it's super acrid, so it'll be very peppery on the tongue, and this will completely, I guess, digest and change the chemical structure to where it's not peppery and it tastes delicious. I think it can often grow on Russula brevipeas, and that I don't know. I don't want to say it's more on that than the other. I'm not quite certain. But we do have a lot of different hypomyces that we find. In fact, we had, I think, 5 at Sequinota that are fairly common. Sometimes they will cover the whole mushroom. There's some that will actually cover or just attack the gills. And I bet somebody will put that on iNet, and you might see that next month when Annie goes over that. All right, I can't see. This was Ben, I think. I can't see the name. Sorry, Ben. I think that's you. Found this in northern Wisconsin. This is always a cool find. At least I like finding it. This can be actually quite large. That can be like a foot or more across each of those lobes, heavily overlapping. We actually found some of this weekend. First time I ever saw this was a Sequinota many years ago. Oh yeah, it's right there. And looking at it from far away, I don't know what you might think. It might be some sort of weird oysters or something, but when you look at it closely, it doesn't have gills or pores. It has teeth. So this is actually Climacodon septentrionale, or the northern tooth. This typically grows on hardwood. You can see it here. I think quite a while ago we found this on a foray in out near Fairfax or something. So it is in this area, and it's fun to find. Okay. So Barbara sent this one. This was actually a picture that was taken at the Costco Regional Park foray we had. And I'm sorry, I'm pretty sure I spelled your name wrong, Barbara. I didn't have much time to proofread and tweak this. We were a little bit with Sequinota this weekend. Anyway, this is a beautiful mushroom. And if you can see where we've scratched it with the knife, you've got this beautiful blue latex that starts dripping out. She didn't get a shot of the top, but you can see even in the edge here that it is quite zonate. And this is Lactarius indigo. I thought it was pretty cool that her fingernails matched the mushroom. This one here was submitted by Chris, found out on Northwest Trail. He at first thought this might have been Geronima. And if you remember the Geronima last month, it was quite yellow, growing from wood. So I can see why he might think, a fluted mushroom growing on some rotting wood. I could see why you would think that. And it also kind of has some dark looking fibrils on the cap, which Geronima tends to have. But if you look closely at this, you'll see one distinct feature here is that stipe is extremely fuzzy. It tends to also have a pretty woolly cap surface sometimes not so much. But this tends to be a very large mushroom. I don't know why. It seems like every time I find it, it looks like this. It's been there for a while. I very seldom find this fresh. But this is actually Pleurotus levis, or the veiled oyster. And John Harper was having a discussion with someone online. And there's another species that looks very similar to this, Pleurotus trienus. And so it's kind of hard to distinguish them. And in the discussion, the guy, and John, if you want to say what the guy's name was, I kind of forgot. He was saying that he thinks a lot of these are probably levis as opposed to trienus. But anyway, that's kind of why I threw that on there. But it could be one or the other, because I am not the best at distinguishing between the two. And they do call it the veiled oyster because when it's young, it'll be veiled, and sometimes you'll see even some of that tissue on the margin of the cap.
Now, I can say a little bit more about that, Mitch. I was on there's a Facebook group that deals with kind of high-level identification, and there was a lot of discussion about distinguishing Dryaenus and levis. And it used to be that people thought, well, levis is out on the West Coast and Dryaenus is mostly on the East Coast. They are hard to distinguish, though the Dryaenus has, it turns more yellow, but the hairy stipe is not distinctive as to these two. And there was in that ID discussion group, a long discussion by Jacob Kalikman, who's working on the list of all the kind of new names and a taxonomy in the new Audubon book to come out soon. And a lot of that is now repeated in a posting in iNaturalist on something that I had found that I had originally said, well, when I'm on the East Coast, this must be a Dryaenus. And a guy up in Vermont, A.D. Gordon, VT, commented and said, well, I think this is the levis. And I sent him an email and asked why. And I was glad to see that he put in a long quote from the post that was on that ID that talks about the distinction between these two. And his bottom line is he thinks 95% of what we're calling Dryaenus on the East Coast is really levis. And so we've pulled off the sample that I had found, to try to verify that, then submitted it to the DNA committee. So hopefully we'll hear in a few months
Cool.
whether that's really true.
Very nice. Yeah. And so there you go. Thanks, John. All right. Another beauty here submitted by April Wyman, found at the Frederick Watershed. I know we've talked about this one in the past, and looking a little closer, a little blurry. Almost looks like a tongue coming out of this piece of wood. This is actually the beefsteak fungus, or Fistulina hepatica. One cool thing about this is, so this is a polypore. It's quite tender. It's edible. One of the few edibles that are recommended. You could actually eat this one raw. So sometimes if we find it, we'll kind of slice it up on the fillets and let people taste. It's quite tangy. It almost has like a citrusy sour note to it. But its pores, instead of all being connected, are actually just kind of like straws hanging next to each other. So if you were to take that cap tissue and kind of turn it back, they would separate fairly easily from each other. I always thought that was kind of cool. And in fact, we had someone else submit the same mushroom. So here's another one submitted by John McKinley Ward. I don't know if it's washed out. It almost looks like it's growing inside of a stump. These were the only pictures he sent, so I'm not so sure, but certainly looks like Fistulina to me. Oh, and when you cut it, it actually has what looked like marbling. So you can see why they would have called it the beefsteak fungus. All right, Branislav sent me this from Frankfurt. What's MI? I'm sorry. Michigan, Minnesota, Michigan. And it's not the Frisbee, it's these little white lumps here growing next to this conifer tree. And the first picture he sent me was this, and I was like, well, I am not too sure. This kind of looks like a puffball, but especially with some sort of internet ID, that could be an Amanita button. So you got to be careful when you're trying to go for puffballs if you think you're going to eat them. So I told him I'm not too sure what that is, but it might be a puffball or something else. And I asked him if he had gotten any newer pictures. And sure enough, here is a new picture that he sent over, and this guy right here. So this is clearly one of the puffballs, probably Calvacia. It does have a bit thicker skin on it. And we have had, so some of the classic ones don't have this rough surface on, the outside of the mushroom. And they're much smoother, tend to be brown. They're not as buried in the ground, and sometimes almost have a base to them, like a sterile base that kind of holds them off the ground. You've got your skull-shaped puffball and so it's cyanoformis and craniformis, or cyathoformis and craniformis. This one looks different, and it's got this cracking thing. I'm not certain which it is, but we did have a couple that ate something similar to this, because people report, well, all puffballs are edible if they're white on the inside. Well, it upset their stomachs, both of them. So if you find something that looks similar to this, and it has a very thick kind of rind on it, be careful. Now, I thought it might be Scleroderma polyrhizum, which can look very much like this. But I would think at this age, the sclerodermas tend to have a purple gleba, which is like the spore mass inside. And at this age, I would have thought that the gleba would have started turning purple by now. And Scleroderma polyrhizum is very common. I get them in my yard like every year, and they kind of stay half buried. And they have a cap kind of like this, and it'll rupture open and have like a purple spore mass. It's kind of stay half buried. So anyway, I just put Calvacia on this one. It's one of the puffballs, and I'm not certain what that one is. All right, April sent this one as well. We found a few, actually some large ones of these guys. I think this is Xylaria polymorpha, or dead man's fingers. So we found some of those at Sequinota. In fact, we found a couple of species of Xylarias. This is another of those ascomycetes, kind of like that Camerops was, where it will have little parathecia, flask-shaped things, all throughout the tissue here that will have asci that poke through and shoot the spores out. Pretty common. And this year I saw a lot of one that they call, I believe, Xylaria cornudeme. And sometimes you'll see them and they're little guys. They're much smaller, maybe an inch tall, and they'll have a white top. We talked about that at one of the monthly table IDs as well. Anyway, moving on, we found quite a few of these too. So this is actually the parasitic bolete, and if you're not unaware of this one, so this guy here is a Scleroderma citrinum, and so Scleroderma is the poison pigskin puff flip ball. I was just mentioned the Scleroderma polyrhizum. That's just a different species that tends to have like a whiter outer surface and stay partially buried. This one tends to be tan and have these little warts all over it. Well, boletes are typically mycorrhizal, and it looks like this one is mycorrhizal as well, but it is always growing from Scleroderma puffballs. I usually find them with Scleroderma citrinum, but I believe they can also grow on other species of the Scleroderma. This is Pseudoboletus parasiticus. Really a fun find. I always like finding this. We found one of these, and one of the guides, Emil, was on the foray, and it was teeny tiny, and he brought it home and put it in a nice humid environment, and it probably tripled in size, he said. So the bolete kept growing up even though it was plucked. So it probably was drawing some nutrients from the Scleroderma.
Mitch, we found 3 of those at Sequinota, which some of the other people seem to be unusual to finding so many. So there might be a lot of those around. And the other thing was, somebody mentioned to me that they thought that particular boletus was edible. So you had a certain ID on it.
Yes, it is edible. I also saw that it's not that great. I haven't tried it myself, but it is edible. And when you look, they say it's rare, but in our area, I don't think it's that rare because we see it pretty often. And it's always a fun find. As is this guy too. Another one found by April at the Frederick watershed. This is a beautiful bolete, and really fun to find. I found this a few years ago, and it kind of has a vague boletus bicolor look to it. It has some blue staining, but if you give this mushroom a whiff, you get a clear. We actually had one of these at Sequinota too that was cut in half, and everybody could go smell it. It gives a clear bullion smell to it. I think it's kind of beef bouillon-y. This is the Lanamoa pallidorosea. It was boletus, and I am not certain of the delineation of why Lanamoa versus, like, now they put boletus bicolor into Bayorangia. I'm not certain why exactly those name changes have occurred, but now they put this into here. But this is a great find, and if you find something that looks similar to bicolor and you smell it and it smells like beef bouillon, you probably have this guy. All right, so that's it for me. April sent me this and I was like, I don't know what the heck that is. And then Connie Durnan sent me this and I said, oh, maybe it's just some gnome droppings. Anyway, thanks everybody.
Hey, Mitch, I would like to say a little bit about just a few of the things that we saw up in Pennsylvania, which are edibles that are going to be appearing here. We're not going to do a presentation on it, but
Sure.
watch for this stuff coming up on iNaturalist as people around the Washington area start to show the good fall mushrooms that are being come up. First of all, we've seen a fair number of chanterelles, but don't give up on the chanterelles. In the last few years, I've found them as late October, early November. And I see some more of the Appalachian chanterelles later in the season. And based on the rains that we're getting, you may see a fair number of those out in September, which back a few years ago, I thought to find them in September was even unusual. We also found up in Sequanota black trumpet chanterelles, a good number of those. People collected those, and they're great on white pizza. I highly recommend looking around for those. They're a little hard to see on the ground, but when you find them, there may be quite a number of them around. We also found already aborted entoloma, which is an interesting mushroom. It's a combination of entoloma abortivum and honey mushrooms, which means that we're also likely to start seeing honey mushrooms pretty soon as well. And both of those are edible, as well as the Entoloma abortivum, but it's not a very good edible. People like the aborted forms better. And my personal view is that it's several different kinds of honey mushrooms that form these. And if you're dealing with what was used to be called the ringless honey, Mitch, do you remember what the name of it is now? It's not
Oh, is it not
Armillaria
Armillaria
tibescens.
tibescens?
I think it's no. They've
Oh
changed
boy.
the genus on that.
Look,
So
I tell you, when you go to these forays on, you have these really knowledgeable people that have been more active and really deep into this. You start saying something, they're like, "Oh yeah, that's this."
oh,
You know,
I remember now. It's called Des Armillaria.
oh,
DES.
Desarmillaria. Yes, I
Yes.
have heard that. Yeah.
So anyways, I happen to think that the one that's on the ringed honey is better if you happen to find that around. The aborted entolomas may be better as well. We found a lot of chicken of the woods up there. I expect that you're going to start seeing that down here pretty soon as well. And remember the earlier you collect it, the better it's going to be. It's going to be nice and soft when it's young, but it comes out and it gets hard pretty quickly.
Oh
Um,
wow.
the hen of the woods, typically we don't see that until mid-September, but you'd be seeing a lot of it by the end of September, I think. So keep an eye out for that. The competing ones that you might confuse with it, black staining polypore, are going to be starting to fade out. I had a half a dozen of them come up in my front yard last week, but I've tried so many this year so far, I just let them go for entertainment value. And we did find both Lactifluus volimus and Carugus, which are the two kind of fishy Lactarius-like, which I like to find. And I don't find a whole lot of them, but we do find them up at Lake Meadwood, which is a good place to look around in the fall. And a little bit, and we also found some large puffballs, or actually it was reported were found about 20 miles away from where we are up in Sequanota. So you may be seeing some of the very large puffballs out there, and most of those are safe to eat, as Mitch was describing. And of course, oyster mushrooms should start to come up. And what you'll see is that it's going to change over from the much brighter white pulmonarius oyster mushroom, which I think is kind of flaccid, into the somewhat brownish and more firm oyster mushrooms. So there's going to be a lot of good things coming up in the next month. Be sure to join our local, that is the MAW INAT group, so that when you take pictures, they will automatically be uploaded and other people can keep track of what is coming up currently, or you can take a look at it yourself to see what other people are posting every weekend when they go out, and stay on top of when these things ultimately appear.
Like you said about the chanterelles, a lot of times chanterelles like it when it's wet. They're not they don't fruit the same as something like morels, where morels tend to come up and they don't like, what would be a good term for it? But basically just kind of growing over time. So they have a certain amount of time that they will grow. Whereas chanterelles, if they have the right conditions, you might see a bigger flush at a certain time, but they'll continue to grow in those same areas over time, especially if it's wet. And I looked at the weather on the phone, and it looks like this might be a really wet few days over the next few days. And if that's the case, that's going to be nice condition, especially for something like black chanterelles, which are probably a little bit more dependent on the moisture and the rain and staying nice and damp for fruiting. So keep your eyes open because they really may be coming up soon.